our guest artist, Billy Hassel. And Billy Hassel is a Texas-based artist with a focus on nature, conservation, and the environment, who produces oil paintings, color lithographs, and watercolors, and exhibits in galleries in Texas, Missouri, and Colorado. Hassel, recently referred to as Mother Nature's stylist by the New York Times, has continued in the natural field he and his colorful paintings bring the experience of the outdoors into indoor spaces for his collectors. Today, Billy lives in Fort Worth, Texas, with his wife Emily and his 2 dogs in an urban neighborhood. So please give a big welcome for Billy Hassel.
Well, thanks. Thank you. And I'd like to thank Laura Beard and acknowledge Robert Jessup and a few other folks from here who helped make this event happen. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to read a little bit. I made notes to try to help me stay on schedule, and then I'll probably abandon my notes and just talk about the work, the images. But I wanted to start, I guess, just by saying, yes, I was born in Dallas and lived most of my adult life actually in Houston, but I went to graduate school up in Indiana at the University of Notre Dame and studied printmaking, and then went to UMass for graduate school. I happened to be living in Boston at the time, and it was an opportunity. I went to graduate school, so I'd had the option to teach at the university level, although that was not really my plan as a student. I felt like there were other opportunities out there in the world to make a living as an artist besides teaching. Having said that, I did teach on and off for a few years, and I really enjoyed it. I think there are lots of opportunities out there that students, for sure, and recent graduates should know about. And I have actually, I didn't expect to make a living as an artist, and be fully self-supporting as an artist, but it turns out that I have been able to do that. And I've raised 2 kids, put them through college, part of that time as a single dad. And so I've been fortunate in a lot of ways, but I've worked as hard as I could to take advantage of the opportunities I had. So what I thought I'd start with today are some, I guess, early inspirations and influences on my work. Let's see if I can get this to go. Well, I'm technologically, where's my tech? I guess, maybe it was this one. Okay, had the wrong, thank you. I have a guy that designed my website, has this theory that some people have these auras that mess with electronics, like energy, that he thinks I might be one of those people. But anyway, I started, this is an old photograph of this James Perry Wilson, who was a painter at the Natural History Museum in New York City back in the 30s. He was an unemployed architect when turned plein air painter when he got this gig, and he did it for the rest of his life. But once upon a time, I thought I wanted to be the guy that paints those backdrops and those dioramas. I think one of my fondest memories of growing up, that's actually the Devil's Tower in Wyoming, which was the backdrop of his painting there. And then the finished diorama. I loved natural history museums when I was growing up, when I was really little, like 5, 6, 7 years old, better than the zoo. And I think part of it was just this sort of surreal, dark environment with these illuminated windows into nature that were kind of, in retrospect, eerily frozen in time. But to be able to be that close to a wild animal, dead and stuff though it was just fascinating to me as a kid. So dioramas, natural history museums, I still kind of find that combination of artifice and reality very interesting as a painter. John James Audubon, I don't know if y'all are familiar with him. Who's heard of Bob Dylan? Anybody? Okay, good. All right, I'm just checking the room. Andy Warhol. I throw those names out. John James Audubon, I don't know, how many of y'all have heard of him? Probably heard of Audubon, yeah. So he was a kind of self-made, he was a frontiersman, but also an artist, a hunter. I mentioned Bob Dylan and Andy Warhol because they, like those artists that came after him, he was, you could call him a liar, but I guess I would call him a very good self-promoter. He lied about his past, he changed his name, he fabricated his own history, not unlike Bob Dylan and Andy Warhol later on, and a host of other artists. I mean, I think that's common for the game. But I still love his paintings. I love his paintings of birds and other wildlife. I've always been kind of fascinated with his compositions because they are really not natural. They were all done from deceased specimens, which he killed himself, and some would argue in excess. And then he posed them into these sort of crazy positions, and this is a pretty good example. I mean, it's not the sort of position you'd see a bird in nature, but he would lay them out and kind of put sticks inside of them and pose them and then build the landscape around the birds. And part of it was to show as much, to give as much information. It's kind of like the Egyptian art where they would show everything in profile, but showing the underneath of the wing and the top of this wing. I mean, it was intended to be educational as well as natural. And his goal was to paint every bird in the Americas, and he largely succeeded at that in his lifetime. So here's another example of Audubon's work. And again, the birds look a little more lifelike, except the one at the bottom obviously looks dead. But keep in mind they were all posed. And I like that. That again, it's kind of an artificial combination of artifice and nature. This is a Flemish still life from the 13th or 14th century. It's I just threw this in here. It's something I've always been kind of interested in. And there's a lot going on in here, but if you look close, you'll see bugs and moths, and I mean, there are a few birds, but it's like this decadence in a way, an overloaded table, but they didn't try to prettify it. I mean, if there were insects crawling around on the fruit, they painted it, and I just have always been kind of fascinated with that. Hieronymus Bosch was another early. When I was real little, I ran across an art history book that my sister, home from college, had brought home, and found this image of the Garden of Earthly Delights, a reproduction. And I had never seen a painting that looked like that. Most of the paintings were paintings of saints or groups of people in the court all dressed up, at least from that period of time. And considering when this was done in the 16th century, it was a pretty unusual painting. And for a kid, I mean, I spent hours staring at it, trying to figure out what the heck was going on in there. And it's like a big old Where's Waldo? And the more you look, the sort of weirder it gets. But and another early painting, The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli from 1480. Years and years later, I got the chance to see some of these in person. The Botticelli's in Florence, and the Hieronymus Bosch is in the Prado Museum in Madrid. And it was great. I mean, it was actually just in the last 10 years that I got to see the paintings in person. This is a medieval tapestry. It's just another inspiration. I grew up going to the Catholic Church in Dallas, and one of the things that always fascinated me were the stained glass windows. This is from the Chartres Cathedral in France. And it's kind of mind-boggling putting the thing together like this. It's like a little art history exercise for me. But this cathedral, they started building it in in 1100, late 1100, finished it in 1220. And it just, when I think about how long ago that was and how sophisticated the art was, it's always amazing. So moving forward, I've always been interested in optical devices. This is a stereo optagon from the turn of the century. I ran across one of these in a flea market and started collecting those stereo postcards. And I like the illusion of 3D, but I also like the simplicity of a lot of the cards. Kaleidoscope, just kind of throwing out some of these things that inspired me when I was little. I've always, and I still do, like the simplicity and graphic nature of these, like, labels, in this case, a vintage fruit label. And I was looking at this, and I like the way it's simplified. Most of these were done as color lithographs, which is one of the media that I use myself now. The prints that I make are all color lithographs. It's an old medium. And this is a detail. It's real fuzzy, but if it's, I was looking at a painting I just finished a couple of months ago, which I'm going to show in a few minutes. It's actually the one on the poster. And I noticed the corner of this crate label had a real similar kind of distribution of those orange shapes. And I thought I'd throw that in there to keep in mind for the future. Other influences as I got older, album art, you know, those of us that are old enough to have lived through that period of time. I mean, that was a great source of interesting visual material in my high school days. So I was 16 years old when the Allman Brothers' Eat a Peach album came out. And the best part was it was a double album, and on the inside was this whole, like, panoramic, very rather hallucinogenic image of a landscape. And at the impressionable age of 16, that I loved this kind of stuff. It just, but that, you know, we loved buying albums. They were $4, bring it home, and not only enjoy the music, but you could enjoy the artwork and then all the liner notes. It was like buying a book. Going back a little bit to other influences, when I went to college, I got exposed to Japanese woodblock prints. I had a professor who collected 19th century Japanese woodblock prints, primarily the ukiyo period. This is a famous wave. Most of you have probably seen this reproduced somewhere. It's been reproduced 1 million times. It's on t-shirts and everything imaginable. And this is from a Japanese painter, printmaker, Hokusai, and it was, he was early 1800s, and a contemporary of his was Hiroshige, who also did a lot of waves and water. And this will make sense in a few minutes as I get into my own work. Other influences going through college and graduate school were the abstract painters. Arshil Gorky, who was another artist who kind of reinvented himself. He migrated from Armenia when he was 16 to avoid the genocide that was taking place, and landed in the United States and changed his name to Arshil Gorky after a Russian writer, Maxim Gorky. And so he sort of assumed an identity and was very involved in the surrealist movement, and then moved into this sort of abstraction, was influenced by Matisse and other painters of the time to the extent that he was criticized in his life for being derivative. But in my mind, he was systematically cultivating his own style of work. And I love this painting. It's called The Calendars. And I think it's from 1948. It may be earlier than that. But it was destroyed in a studio fire that he was beset by one tragedy after another. But images of it have survived. So he might have been influenced by Matisse. And these probably don't seem real radical now by today's standards, but just the way this was painted, this was 1911, 1912. painters weren't painting like this. I mean, and it's a fairly large painting. He did tons and tons of versions of this. But the painterliness of it and the sort of disintegration of the edges of forms and that sort of thing, nobody was doing that. Another painting, Goldfish and a Sculpture by Matisse. And then even more abstract painting by Matisse. I think this is from 1914, A View of Notre Dame. And if you, I don't know, I just kind of like the lineage and sort of seeing how things link up. But an artist that was very strongly influenced by Gorky was Willem de Kooning. And this is my all-time favorite painting. I think it's the best abstract painting in the world. But, and it's not quite this big, but it's a large painting that he spent over a year, I think, working on and reworking. But the abstract expressionists, I think for me, this is Joan Mitchell, one of the few females associated with the abstract expressionist movement. And this, I think, is perhaps a detail, but the painting itself is 108 inches by 80 inches wide, so a very large monumental scale painting. But these were the things that were interesting me when I got into college and was thinking about how to develop some kind of, you know, I guess a response to painting. This is Jasper Johns, who's also associated with the abstract expressionists, but in my mind, he's sort of unclassifiable. He presages pop art, conceptual art, but the surface quality and the mark making links him with abstract expressionism. So I'm going to go into some of my work, starting with a painting, I guess maybe my first oil painting or close to it, painting of a skunk from 1978. And it's a small painting, it's 18 by 24. And I really didn't know exactly what I was doing, but for example, the bottom I painted with alizarin crimson, and it, to this day, has never completely dried. I put it on real thick, and it's just one of those paints that takes forever to dry. But I think I was kind of aiming for that graphic quality. And I'd been mainly a printmaker as an undergraduate, so my work was almost all black and white. This was an early drawing, well, 1981. And I was actually in graduate school at this point. And I was real inspired by folk art and the kind of simplicity and directness of outsider art, untrained art, which is a little ironic, I guess, because I was in school taking art classes. But back in those days, you were pretty much given materials and not a lot of technical instruction. So, I mean, in a way, it was nice to have the opportunity and the freedom to explore possibilities, but at the same time, there was a time in my life when I wished I'd had more actual instruction on how to paint, how to apply materials. So this is 22 by 30. It's not a big drawing. This is an intaglio print. It's 24 by 28. And it's etching in aquatint. And this is very characteristic of the work I was doing at the time, which again was largely black and white. And this is an oil painting from 1982. I'm sorry, 1990. I think it is 1990. Somewhere late 80s. I can't remember exactly, but it was all, I picked this because it was pretty also characteristic. I think as I evolved into painting and introduced color, I still kept a lot of that kind of chunky composition inspired by Mexican folk art, wood carvings, and I guess some of the, all those other things that influence the direction of the color. So over time, these are, I kind of jumped forward. I just decided to do paintings from the last 10 years, kind of a sample. This is called Wake Up Call from 1999, and it's 48 by 60. And I think in trying to combine that abstract sense and figuration, which I could never escape from completely, I got into a kind of a figure field thing and used birds as a way of hooking, I guess, both the viewer and linking the paintings. So a lot of these paintings during that time had a central image and then a background that I tended to explore with. And actually, this one was based on a William Morris wallpaper pattern. I was living in St. Louis at the time, and it seemed like a lot of the old houses in the old neighborhoods, these Victorian houses would have these elaborate wallpapered dining rooms and living rooms and bathrooms, and it seemed like for a while I lived in an old part of St. Louis, and it seemed like it was everywhere. And I think the rooster, and I'm not going to analyze every single paint I go through, but the rooster to me sort of symbolized, like morning, like, a rooster crowing at the break of day. And my impression of St. Louis, and no offense to Laura, who's from St. Louis or lived there for a while, I loved St. Louis, but I felt like it was kind of a sleepy city that fell asleep at the turn of the century and needed a wake-up call. But so these were other paintings inspired kind of like by the wallpaper, but in this case I put a background behind the floral pattern that gave it more atmosphere and a little bit more space. And then this background is back to de Kooning. I think de Kooning has sort of been a continuous, like in the back of my mind, that painting excavation that I showed earlier has just continued to pull me in some way. And even though my approach to this is different, there's, it's like that kind of abstraction that he was doing, which consisted of shifting planes and sort of things that were slightly anatomical but ambiguous, have never quite left me. And I've done lots and lots of paintings and prints sort of trying to use that kind of abstraction, but played off of this very realistic element, being the bird. And I pushed it a little further. These are like 5 foot by 6 foot oils. This is called circling. And I've kept the bird kind of central image, but a lot of other images have popped in. But the painting, I guess these kind of allowed me to explore a more abstract direction in the work. This is spin, 5 feet by 6 feet. I tend to pick certain sizes of canvases, and I do a lot of similar sizes. In this case, 60 by 72 is a common size that I still use, and 50 by 48. There's some others but I like that modular thing, and I don't know why. I think it also makes me feel like I can be more inventive within that format. This is a painting called The Eye of the Hurricane. And it was kind of inspired by the hurricane that hit New Orleans some years back and all the chaos and the aftermath. And then a quite different night painting. It's called Night Garden. And this relates back to the medieval tapestry. I mean, these kinds of patterns and fields of repeated pattern have always interested me, and I think even my interest in birds has to do with the patterns on their wings and the patterns on the markings on their bodies, and so this is just taking it to another extreme. This is called homing instinct, and the homing has to do with the birds that migrate and the fish that migrate, and then the pattern's just kind of in between, a layer of space. At the same time I was doing those paintings, I was doing more naturalistic paintings. So I've kind of gone back. I guess those paintings covered several years, and then, but my interest in nature never quite went away, and that interest in being an outdoor naturalist has also sort of kept a parallel path going. This is called Wellspring, and it's from 2012, and it's 60 by 72 also. I think most of these are that size. Roadrunner, West Texas. It's 60 by 72. And this was from 2007. The painting before was actually earlier. Well, it was done about the same time as this one. It was in 2012. This is Great Kiskadee, South Texas. And it was probably around this time that I got approached by the Nature Conservancy to do some artwork for them, a commission. And I don't have an image of that, but I was commissioned around actually in the early 90s to do a color etching based on the endangered animals and birds of the Edwards Plateau near Austin. And it started out as a side project, but it ended up developing what's now about a 15 or 20-year relationship with conservation groups. In addition to the Nature Conservancy, I've worked with Audubon, Texas, and currently doing a project with Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation. And I never really thought that would become central to my mission as an artist, but it has certainly informed and inspired the work that I do. But, already having a leaning towards nature, it was a good fit. This is alligator and egret, and the landscape was from a sketchbook that I kept up around north, it's on the Louisiana border of Texas. Another, and that previous painting was another size that I've done, 36 by 80 is the size on that. I don't know if the size makes that much difference to know, and this is freshwater life. And this is kind of the flora and fauna that I grew up with. I grew up in Dallas. I spent a lot of time along creeks and around White Rock Lake, and was riding my bicycle across a spillway when I was, maybe 9 or 10 years old, 11. And there was an alligator gar washed up on the shore that was probably that big. I mean, it was huge and it looked prehistoric, and I'd never seen a fish that close up that was that prehistoric looking. And I realized there are all kinds of things that lurk under the water. An alligator, snapping turtles, soft-shelled turtles. These were all things that lived in the creeks around where I grew up. And there's still some of those things, but a lot of those creeks are gone. This was actually a commission painting. It's 36 by 80, and it was based on a ranch up in Colorado. And it's a pretty faithful rendering of the ranch, I guess. And this is sort of the other extreme of what I'm interested in doing. I never wanted to be a landscape painter. I never was really that interested in being a realistic painter, but I do love to plein air paint, like go outdoors with a watercolor journal and sketch the landscape. And if I do any kind of drawing on a regular basis, that's what I do. So these large-scale landscape paintings are just a natural extension of that. In case I've got a heavy thumb. This was another commission piece. This is an odd size, but it's roughly 5 feet by 7 feet, and it's based on the Caprock country up near Amarillo, near Canyon, Texas, the Paladero Canyon. And this is an egret. And this was, again, that place, it's that swamp up on the Louisiana-Texas border inspired this painting, which is a little more playful. I mean, it's not exactly in any kind of real perspective. And this was, I would say, I looked at Audubon and his crazy, positioning of birds. The egret in the middle, I wanted it to be unusual, in its shape, and be more of an abstraction. I threw this in. This was a watercolor I did as a commission on some private, some private land in North Carolina, and it was it's probably one of the larger watercolors I've done. I think it's 30 something by 40. I mean, it's not huge, but I do a lot of watercolors like sketches, and it's not very often that I do a really kind of finished watercolor. But when I do watercolors, I wanted to have the same kind of saturation and presence as an oil painting. Let's see, just some other more recent paintings. I started a project with the Texas Parks and Wildlife about a year and a half ago, and it has taken me to different parts of Texas, particularly in this case the Gulf Coast, and these are Canadian geese, the Texas shore, And again, these are more naturalistic, and I think hark back to those dioramas. I thought a lot about those. In fact, some of the sketches from this particular painting came from, I did at the Natural History Museum in Dallas. They've got a display with Canadian geese and the snow geese, and it's actually a pretty good place to draw because birds don't ever stand still. So if you've got a diorama, you can sit there on a stool and sketch them without them moving. So this, I did this little series of paintings. It's kind of based on West Texas, so jackrabbit and meadowlarks. And these and the previous are 50 inches tall by 48 inches wide. And I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. Well, not that quickly, but Roadrunner. And this is called The Evening in South Texas. It's kind of the same sort of flora and fauna of, I guess when I was little again, I was the youngest of 4 kids, and my oldest brother worked in the oil fields in South Texas. And so we made a couple of trips down to visit him. And this is kind of how I remember it. I mean, there was wildlife everywhere. We actually drove into the little town, Freer, Texas, in the middle of the night, and we had to drive about 25 miles an hour so as not to hit a coyote or a bobcat or a jackrabbit. So this is the painting I was mentioning before that's on the poster. This is called Tangerines, and it's 50 by 48. And this was in the last show I had in Dallas was in May, and some of these paintings, including this one, were in that show. And the inspiration behind this was actually from a trip to California, and there was a tangerine grove, and I took some pictures of the tangerines, and just because they were so graphic, just looking at them. But it reminded me of, well, I'm going to throw that detail back in there, which again was sort of coincidental, off the fruit crate. And I think that the stylization of the leaves and the oranges and even the bird to some extent kind of relate to that simplified image on the crates. And but the real inspiration behind this painting was this painting by Maxfield Parrish, who was an American painter and illustrator around the turn of the century. It was late 1800s to the early 1900s. Most of his career was in the early 1900s, but I've always loved this painting. I mean, it's kind of goofy looking in a way, but those big lanterns, I've always loved the luminosity of them. And I actually, again, I've never seen anything but a reproduction of this painting until I visited the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas. I don't know if anybody in here has had a chance to go visit that museum, but it's got an incredible collection of American art, including this Maxfield Parrish painting and a couple of others. But I've always liked the luminosity of not just these lanterns, but the sky and the kind of atmosphere that he accomplished in his work. And this is one of the last paintings that I have recently finished, which looks like a complete departure, but it really is kind of the way I would like to paint or like to be painting, and I don't think it's necessarily contradictory to go from one sort of extreme to another. And usually they're not standalone. Usually I'll do a group of paintings that are more related. And I like the overworking, like in having this underpainting showing through the surfaces. So I think this type of painting allows me to use more of what I think paint is best for. And so, it's never, I feel like I can try other things if I want to. And I just threw this one back in to show that there is a continuum there. It's not, just a radical departure. So a couple of color lithographs. So these are 22 by 22, and essentially I'm trying to do the same thing with these lithographs that I do with the paintings. It's this figure-ground relationship, and I think what I like about it is the figure stands out, but at the same time, it ties in, the colors, and some more successfully than others, but I like this one. This one's called Blue Jay Landing. This is Brown Pelican, and I actually did 2 versions of this after the BP oil spill. One was blue, and then the other one is like all silver and kind of gray and black, kind of a before and after. And I actually like the other one kind of better graphically, and this harks back to the Japanese woodblock prints. Another color lithograph called Trinity River, kind of revisiting that, the flora and fauna of the river. This was actually commissioned by the Earth Day Dallas about 5 years ago. They commissioned an edition of prints. It's 30 by 22. But it's about 12 plates, and I don't know if there are any printmakers in the room, but it takes a lot of careful planning to do a print with that much color and keep the registration that tight. And I have a really, really good printer that I work with in Austin. But these are not reproductions of paintings. They're like 12 or sometimes 13 separate drawings for a drawing for each color. And then they're all burned onto light-sensitive plates and then printed in registration. And there are small editions of 30. And just one more of those, another Hiroshige. So my working process, I'm going to try to get through this. So I do a lot of outdoor watercoloring. You might not necessarily gather that from looking at my work, but whenever I travel, I take a watercolor journal. I brought a couple of them with me. And plein air painting is one of my favorite things to do, plus I get a lot of material and a lot of ideas from it. I mean, this is a pretty good example. I usually do a watercolor and then take a picture. Sometimes I take a picture, do a watercolor, and then take another picture, because the light changes so fast that, like this watercolor, I probably did 15 minutes or so before the photograph was taken, and you can see the light's already changed a fair bit. Okay. I'm not sure I'm still being recorded, but I guess I'll find out. So that's Colorado. This is Hans Peak in Colorado, and a watercolor that I did I couldn't get them both in the same picture. And then just the kind of evolution from a watercolor to an oil painting. And I've done that on and off. A lot of the landscapes are developed that way. And that's just a shot of my studio. I have an old storefront in Fort Worth. And it always looks different. But the back room has a wood shop, and I build frames and stretch canvases, and then this is kind of a all-purpose work area, and I paint on the wall on the side there. So some other projects are public art projects. This is a mosaic mural for a fire station north of Fort Worth, Fire Station 34. I did this through the Fort Worth Public Art Program a couple of years ago. And, well, let's see if this is still working. There we go. This is a large floor medallion at the DFW airport. I guess I threw these in partly as opportunities as young artists. I mean, Fort Worth and Dallas both have great public art programs. And if you get your work registered or, in their system, you'll get notices and prompts about projects that come up. My work lends itself to this kind of application, but there's a lot of really cool sculptural things and architectural opportunities that I think it's worth looking into. I've done maybe 3 of these projects. This is just a detail of the mosaic at the airport. And they've been real learning experiences for me. The first thing you kind of have to get used to is you're going to have to collaborate with other people. It's a little different than just working in your studio. You're going to have to work with architects and contractors and oftentimes electricians, and so it's a collaborative process. And yep. Okay, I'll wrap it up. I'm about toward the end. So the last thing I'm working on are these. I'm doing a series of prints for Texas Parks and Wildlife. They commissioned me to do 5 prints over about a 2-year period. This is based on the coastal area of Texas, based on Powderhorn Ranch, which is a big coastal prairie they acquired a couple of years ago. This is Llano River, Texas Hill Country, and these are both lithographs, just done the same process, the same process as the others I showed, just with a little more specific subject matter. This is the third in the series. I've got 2 more to do, West Texas and East Texas. And then this is me working on a design for a architectural element in a new restaurant in Fort Worth. And it's like a public art project, but it was privately commissioned. But and this is just a design, so it's I was doing it with black ink and black gesso on paper, and it's not even very good paper. I didn't expect it to be a permanent work of art. A couple of details of it. But I had a good time doing it. My drawing is 9 feet long and about 7 inches tall, and it's going to be reproduced. Originally it was going to be cut out of metal, but it's actually now, because of the cost, it's going to be printed on acetate panels that'll be slightly curved, and there'll be 5 of them put together, so it'll be a linear, like 45-foot long linear, kind of a light feature. So it'll be a repeated pattern, but it's a 9-foot section repeated, so it won't be that obvious that it's been repeated. And I think that's the last image. So these are just little details of that. So that's kind of all I've got as far as visuals. And I think we might have a minute or 2 for some questions.
Yeah, we have 6 or 7 minutes for questions.
Okay.
I think one thing you didn't mention is that on YouTube there is a PBS documentary on
Oh, yeah.
going through the process of making the images and then the lithographic process, which is really fascinating. And I think it's about 9 minutes long.
Right. Yeah. That's actually was aired just this past month. But when Texas Parks and Wildlife commissioned me to do this print project, they did a documentary film that just came out. They worked on it for about a year, from my very first visit down to the ranch on the coast. And one of the nicest parts of it is this little time-lapse section on how the lithographs are made, and it's filmed in the studio in Austin while we're working. And unless you've taken a lithography class, which maybe some of you have, you wouldn't necessarily understand how that process works. And so it's a very good educational thing. And that's on, if you Google the art of conservation, Billy Hassel, on YouTube, it'll come up. And then there's also a little trailer, so don't be deceived by that. The trailer is about 3 minutes long, but the trailer actually has the lithographic portion in almost its entirety.
Putting your name in too, it comes up.
Yeah, a lot of stuff comes up that way. But I think one thing I guess I'd like to mention, and I don't want to use up all the time for questions, but is that these projects with Parks and Wildlife kind of took me, I think I mentioned it before, it took me a little bit out of the main path of my mission as an artist. But I think it's been really surprising to me it was a nice opportunity, for one thing. And the magazine article has reached a lot of people, but I'm getting calls and things from people that wouldn't normally go into an art gallery or an art museum. And so it's kind of cool to reach a different audience than just the art audience. And I think one of the things I like about public art is that it is just that. It exists for the public. Anybody can enjoy it, drive by it, see it, walk on it if it's on the floor. And it's sort of bringing art out of the refined environments of the established venues and putting it in a place where everybody can enjoy it. And and I guess I should take some questions, so if anybody has. Yes?
Have you ever worked on any field guides?
Have I what? I'm sorry?
Have your art in any field guides?
I haven't had any reproduced in field guides, although I've collected a lot of field guides. I have as many books on nature and animals as I do on art books, I think. But I have had things reproduced in ecological journals and environmental kinds of things, like Scholastic Magazine did a thing on nature and water a few years ago and used one of my paintings in there. So it has been kind of reproduced in a few places. Yes?
When you're painting animals, do you use like photos or like taxidermy animals or like what do you use?
That's a good question. I use pretty much everything that's available. Usually I'll observe something, like if I see a bird out, when I'm walking or out in nature somewhere, I'll try to do a rough sketch of it, and then I'll look it up, and like probably everybody else, I use the internet, I search for stock photos of things, but my favorite thing is to go to, like the Natural History Museum is where I always went when I was younger and in college, and just drew the stuffed animals, because I think something about drawing something versus just sort of extracting an image that's already out there. I think when you draw it, you process it in a very different way, and I think the internet and all that now, Photoshop, makes it so easy to just harvest images and combine them in very, very cool ways, but somehow it takes some of that, takes your fingerprint off of it or something, but yeah, I use it all. I've got books and whatever resource I can get my hands on. Yes?
At what point in your career did you feel like you started getting like paid well or gaining traction, I guess, for your work or getting commissions?
That's a good question too. I think if I understand that, I began to show my work almost right out of graduate school. I got invited to be in a gallery in Houston, and they began to sell work almost right away and got commissions. But the economy had a lot to do with that. The timing was part of that. But I think it took me probably 15 or 20 years to get to a point where I could comfortably step away from, a teaching job or any other sort of source of income and work full-time in my studio. And I did it. It was kind of a calculated risk. I, for one thing, never thought I would be able to survive off just sales and not have another source of income. And so I did it carefully and cautiously for a period of time. But at the time I did that, I was teaching adjunct classes at 2 different universities, TCU and UTA, and making roughly $9,500 a semester. It was I couldn't live on it. And I had 2 high school age kids living at home. I was a single father, and I was getting some public art projects and some commissions, so that supplemented the income. But I did that for several years, and I finally had enough commissions that I knew were coming in that I didn't teach for a semester, and then I didn't teach for another semester, and then I quit being invited to teach. But an interesting thing happened. The more time I spent in my studio, the more opportunities I got to show and offers for, commissions, public art opportunities. So I think it's a question of how you direct your energy. That's the way I felt. I know that sounds kind of ambiguous, but I think I really do believe the more, if you're devoted to something and you pursue it, opportunities sort of happen. But it takes a big leap of faith. And I think, like I said, I was cautious for a long time and kept one foot, I tried to spread out the opportunities to make money. And I think even once I got into a gallery, it became really apparent you need more than one gallery. You need a couple of distribution points to ensure that you make enough sales. But yeah, I tend to I tend to be a little maybe less optimistic about the opportunities that are out there. But I've done it. I think if I can do it, other people can. And I know a lot of artists that do support themselves. Not they don't get rich, but they have pretty good lives off of just their work. So. Do we have time for any more, or we should wrap it up?
One more question?
Yep.
Does Texas folks in wildlife send you to places, or do you kind of pick places to go?
They send me they have projects, like the one I'm going to next is a pronghorn relocation project in South Texas. So they'll send me or put me in touch with a wildlife biologist, and then I can pretty much travel around, but and I have all, freedom, but like on the Llano River, which I showed a few minutes ago, I met a wildlife biologist who took me to 3 different places along the river. So they're kind of specific about the geographical spot and then kind of turn it over to me to interpret it. But anyway, thanks a lot. Y'all have been great. So